Hey everyone, and welcome back to Salesforce Mojo. Over the last couple of weeks, I've gotten a couple of requests about how to actually create the flow that I mentioned in one of my previous videos on setting up a storefront user creation flow. So today we'll be talking about the different ways we can actually set up a flow that will allow us to easily create storefront users within the Salesforce experience. So I thought before we dove straight into flows and really digging into it, it might be helpful if we first just do a quick diagram of what this could look like. This is going to be a little bit of an experiment for me as we go through this. So if you really like how we break this out in Lucidchart here, which is the tool we'll be using, and then go in and actually see hands-on, let me know and I'll definitely be doing more of it in the future. So before we dig into actually how we're going to do this in Flow, I want to just put a disclaimer out here. There are probably 5 or 6 different ways you can do this flow. This is personally my preference as I build this type of flow, but there definitely are other ways of doing it. So don't feel like you're locked into only doing it this way. There are more complex ways of doing it, and there are also possibly simpler ways. But I find that the way we're about to walk through this is the most scalable and also architecturally minded. So that's kind of why we're going to be doing it this way. Okay, so first thing here is let's put in a swim lane. I like to do this because it helps kind of break up the flow in my head. And we are actually going to have 2 different flows here, so I think it'll be nice to break out what that looks like. In this top flow, we're going to have a screen flow to start with. So kind of the experience we're looking for is I'm going to dive into Salesforce for just a moment here. I'll go over to our accounts. And the end result that we're trying to achieve is going into one of our contacts. Oh, that one doesn't have a contact. Let's go to Fred. Fred has Fred right here. And the experience we want to have is something similar to what the out-of-the-box one has. You can see this has kind of all the customer access things over here on the right-hand side. So the experience we want is a button on the contact that will open up a screen flow and allow us to enter some information, and then that to actually go and create the user and give us the ability to do all the things that we're looking for. In order for us to do that though, we're going to need a screen flow that handles kind of that experience as we walk through the screens, and then we need the capability to set up a user and then set up a permission set. And I'd like this button to be a little bit fancier than just kind of a bland button here. I'd like it to be dynamic so that the button only shows when the person actually needs to be enabled and not when it doesn't need to be enabled, aka I've already enabled this person, so why are you showing me an enable button again? So I want to make sure that's dynamic. So for us to do this, let's go back to Lucidchart now. We're going to need a flow that, let's call this storefront user creation. So let's first grab over a process note here. And this isn't going to be all of the ins and outs of the flow. This is just to give us a big picture of what we need to do at a top level. And then we'll get into the specifics when we get into the flow. So first thing we need to do is we need to get the contact because this is a screen flow. Once we have the contact, then the next thing we want to do is make sure that we get the user as well. And once we have the user, then we know, okay, we have the context information, and then we can get the user from that, and I'll show you how to do that once we get into Flow. But then that will allow us to make this a little bit smarter where we can say, oh, this user has already been set up and created. We don't need to do this again. So that kind of gets the foundation here. We're going to do a decision split, but we're not going to put that in here. The next thing we'll put in here, just to give us a high-level overview, is Screen 1. And Screen 1 is basically going to be the user entry screen where you're putting all the details that will really help you kind of fill in the information. Once we have that information, the next thing we're going to do is we need to actually create the user. So this is kind of where the paths diverge here. There are a couple different ways you can do this. Option 1 is you can try to keep this all inside of a single screen flow. The risk you have with doing that is you may come across a couple of things called mixed DML statements. And what that means is that when you're trying to interact with both the user, permission set, and contact, you really can't do that inside of a single flow because of how they're attached together. So with that being said, because we want to be able to create the user, the permission set, and also update the contact record afterwards to tell us if this person has been set up already or not very easily, we can't do that all inside of a single flow. So what I like to do is create a user platform event, and we'll just call it PE here for short. That platform event basically allows us to stitch multiple flows together or multiple interactions together as kind of this asynchronous layer between the two of them. So what we'll do here is we'll put a new node in here, and we're going to say create platform event. And if you're not familiar with platform events, there's something that's really good about Salesforce. You should go look on Trailhead about it. I'll just give you a quick overview here, but the idea is that these are kind of like temporary records, right? They're stored in this platform event object that allows us to stitch multiple things together asynchronously, which gives us a lot of flexibility in how we build things. So let's start drawing some arrows here. So we're going to go from here to here. The next thing we're going to do is drop this down into the platform event. And then from there, this last swim lane is really going to be our permission set flow. And this permission set flow will basically do the assigning of the permission set once that platform event has been triggered. So we'll grab one of these down here, and we're going to say this is create the permission set based on the information that we've been given. And the last thing we'll do up here across the top is we're going to update the contact with that flag we talked about. And there will be a decision split between the two of them, so we know if it was successful, and then we'll update based on that success. So that's kind of the stage of what we're trying to build here. Now let's actually dive into Salesforce and stitch this flow together. All right, let's first start by going over to flows. And once we get there, we're going to create a new flow. And we're going to call this our Storefront user flow, and it's going to be a screen flow. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with a get. So we'll come over here and do a get, and we'll do get contact, and we'll select contact down here, and then we will actually enter the ID and the value. We need to create a new resource called a variable, and we're going to call it record ID. And this record ID is automatically passed when we have a flow that's a button that's in a actual record inside of the layout. So we'll create that, and then we'll be able to use it as kind of our input here in order to get the record that we're actually interacting with. Now that we have the contact, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the user. Not the update records. We're going to get the get records, and we'll do get user and user down here. And what we'll actually do is there is a contact field, I believe, contact ID here, and we're actually going to pass in the ID from that get we just got on the last step. And what this will do is it'll say, okay, I have the contact ID now. Now let's use that contact ID and go find the user record that's actually connected to that contact. And that's kind of how the community users work. There's kind of a linking between the two of them. If there isn't one already created, then that's how we know that this person hasn't been set up yet. All right, so now that we have that get user, the first thing we're going to do after is create a decision, and we're going to say, does the user exist? And the kind of two paths here is yes, they exist, and does not exist. And you can name these whatever you want as you kind of go through this to make it easier for you to understand. I like to pose it as a question, and then the two outcomes kind of makes it easier for me to understand which path the person is going down based on the information. So the thing we're going to do in here is we're going to do get users, and let's just say ID, and we're going to say is null false. Which means that the person does exist. So it's a little bit of inverse logic here, but is null false means that it is not null, if that's not confusing at all. And then if they do not exist, they'll go down this kind of default path here. Okay, so now that we have those paths here, we're going to start by going with the exists route. And we're basically going to throw a screen on here with some display text that essentially says this user has already been created. So this is just kind of our default outcome just in case things happen and then we'll give it an API name. And then you're welcome to do, really whatever you need to with the footer, what makes the experience better. I usually try to hide the previous button and hide the pause button in these cases. And then in the header up here, you can just say storefront user, and then storefront user creation. There we go. And that will give us kind of that name up across the top. So now that we have kind of the default out of the way, that will allow the kind of screen flow to finish if a person gets here. Hopefully never get here, because we're going to do some dynamic button interaction later, but we always need that fallback. Okay, so now we're going to go down the right path here. So it does not exist. This is when we're creating a user. We'll come over here and go to screen. So if you remember back to my last video, or maybe it was a couple of videos ago, when we were actually creating that user for the first time, you'll remember there's a couple of required fields here. So kind of the screen we want to have on here is we want the ability to default text into these inputs, but also have the ability to change information if you need to when you're actually setting up the user. Because in some cases, your contact information might be slightly different than your email information, and so we need that ability to kind of customize that. So we're going to do this. We're going to throw in a couple of input fields here. Let's go down to text, and let's throw a couple of them in here because we're going to need, I think, 4 or 5 of these. But the first two we're going to start with is first name and last name. And last name. And we'll mark both of these as required, actually. And then the next one we'll do is email. We'll want this as required too. Username and required. And I think the last one we're going to need here is nickname. Which this is actually one of the fields that you could have it automatically calculate, create some type of formula or automation that fills this information in, but we will need both the nickname and alias in order to get it created. Last thing I'd like to do, just as a best practice, is just to throw a display text on here and say something along the lines of, please fill in the following information for the user. All right, something like that. All right, and then we're going to give this a label as well, and we'll call this user information. All right, do the same thing with the footer here, hide the previous and pause button, and that sure looks good to me. Okay, last thing we're going to do is, I mentioned kind of defaulting some of this information because this information in theory should be on the contact already. So let's go over here and we're going to go to default value. And what we can do is we can go to our get contact and we can do the first name here. So it's going to default the contact. Let's do last name right there. And then we'll do email as well. All right, and then we'll come over to username, which will default to the user or to the email as well. But you can definitely override that if their email their email is already used as a username in another instance. All right, so now we have our screen. So we've done a little bit of the hard work here. Let's save it real quick and call it Storefront user creation. All right, save. Okay, now that we have that, we're going to do 2 things. We have the information for the user we need to create. The last step that we need is a profile ID in order for us to actually correctly provision that user. We don't want to hard code the ID if at all possible, because if we hard code that profile ID into the create user, then as we promote it from lower to upper instances, we're going to run into issues where the ID actually is not the same. So the next thing we'll do is we'll come over here and we will do a get records. We're going to get profile, and we'll come down to profile if I can spell correctly here. And we're going to do that based on the name. and we're gonna go find what that name is. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. So we'll come over to our profiles. And I think we're using the buyer user profile from Quick Start. So, in theory, this would be something that would be a little more specific to your store, but we'll use it for this case. So we're going to say name is equal to this, and this will pull back the first record that matches that and give us that ID we need. So that's kind of the best practice there. Okay, so this next part is where we actually create the user. So I'm going to fill in some of this information, and then I'm going to be right back. Because it's a lot of typing, and you're probably just interested in actually seeing the results and having me talk through it versus me typing a bunch of letters there. Okay, now that I've typed all that, we'll come back and we'll actually look at it. So a lot of different fields that are required when you're creating a user through a flow, really anything. But the reason you don't see this in kind of a typical user creation is because it defaults a lot of this information for you. So at the top here, pretty standard information: email, first name, last name, username, contact ID, all the things we've already talked about. Then it starts to get a little bit weird. So we have the email encoding key, which is required. We have to state that it actually is active. We need to put in the language locale key and the locale's SID key and the time zone SID key. All this information, you can go look in the help docs. They give you all the values there, but you can see kind of from my screen what I'm using here in the US. So that information is required to kind of default some of the information for the user. From there, you can actually put in the profile ID that we grabbed. So this is where you would, in theory, manually put it, but we're dynamically grabbing that information so that it doesn't break as we deploy it. The last two things are the formulas to actually calculate the community and alias for the user. And we put this in formula because these fields have restrictions on how big they can be. So we know we're grabbing kind of the nickname from the input, but if you put a nickname in that's 20 characters long, it's not actually going to work. It's going to be too large and you're going to get errors. So why don't we go over and look at those formulas so you can see what they look like. The alias one basically takes the last name and then it cuts it off at 8 characters here. This is not foolproof, I will say, and if I remember correctly, alias is required to be unique. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky when you're setting this up. So there definitely is an ability to do a little bit more randomization here, but you can see that we're also using the current date to try to make it as unique as possible. So anyway, this is kind of what we have used in the past and has been pretty successful with, but you definitely could do something different here. The next one is very similar, but it's using the nickname that you put in. This nickname is actually what shows up inside of the community. And so that's why we want the ability to kind of put that real name in there. But again, it does have some character restrictions here. So we put some uniqueness so we make sure that it actually is unique. All right, so now that we've done that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a decision split to make sure that we actually did create the user successfully. And if we didn't, then we'll actually go and basically throw an error through a screen flow. So we're going to go and do a decision, and we'll call this user exists ? And we'll say user exists here, and we will go to our user, and we're going to use this user ID from that creation, and we're going to say does not equal null here or empty. And we're going to have to change this, it looks like. We'll put a 1 right here, and then our default will be user did not create. And once we've done that, we'll again put the default in and say, let's throw a screen flow in here that is a display text. And we will drop this in that I've used in the past. So once we've done that, we'll throw a label in and we'll say failed to create user. Do the same thing with the footer down here, and done. Let's see. All right, so failed user. Okay, so now let's backtrack for a second to make sure everyone's following here. So we've input the information about the user, we've gotten the profile ID, We have then created the user. We've checked to make sure the user was created. And once we actually have created the user, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to update our contact. And we're going to update our contact with a flag that basically says this community user has been created. That doesn't exist for us yet, so the next thing we're going to do is click Save here, and we're going to hop back over to our setup, go to our objects, go to Contact, and we'll come over to Fields and Relationships. We'll click New here, and we'll go to Checkbox. And you really can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it Storefront User. And we're going to have it automatically be unchecked, and we're going to say if this is checked, a storefront user exists. Okay, but again, you can call this whatever you want, put whatever description you want in there, but we basically need it to be a checkbox on the contact. We'll make sure it has access to the right information here. Click Next here, and yeah, sure, let's throw in the layout for now. All right, so we'll come back over to our flow. Let's refresh it so we grab that new metadata from our contact, and we'll come down to user exists, and we'll do an update to contact. So we'll say update contact flag, and let's do contact here, and we're going to do it based on the ID of the contact that we grabbed earlier. And we're going to flag that storefront, and we'll mark this as true. Okay. Let's click Save one more time here. Okay, so we've gotten through a majority of this. Now let's go back to our Lucidchart for a second and just kind of reorientate. So we've done the initial get users, the get contact, we've done the screen right here, we've done the update. So the last piece is that we need to set the permission set. And this is where, we've now dealt with a couple of objects in here. If we were to throw the permission set on here as well, typically it'll actually throw that mixed DML. So this is where we want to split it out into platform events. And it's also a good use case to use this for. So we're going to come back over to our setup, and we'll go to Home, and we'll type in platform events. And you'll notice we don't have any platform events in here, so we're going to create one, and we're going to call this, let's actually call this permission set, if I can spell, and permission sets. You could create this with whatever name you wanted. If you wanted something more generic than this, you definitely could. If you wanted something more specific, you definitely could. I like to create it with kind of this generic permission set name. Because then you could reuse it for internal user permission sets. You could reuse it for multiple different storefronts and just pass in the right context. So anyway, that's kind of the reasoning behind that. But anyway, so we'll click deployed here, we'll click save, and then we're going to need a couple of fields here so we can pass in the right information. Okay, so we're going to do two fields to start with. The first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a text field in here for the user ID. So we're going to call this user ID, and it'll be length of 18, and it will be required. And once we do that, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to call this one permission set name. Okay, and we're going to call this, or give it a 255 here, and also make it required as well. Now, there are a couple different fields you could throw on here if you wanted to as we get a little more advanced with this. We're going to start with a basic use case, and I think this will cover what we need here. But you also could throw in a type field, and you could throw in a active flag or not. And what this would allow you to do is handle inactivation and reactivation of users, and also handle different capabilities with this one platform event. For our use case, we're just kind of going down this one path here, but you could come back and enhance this with some of that capability so that different buttons showed up if they were active or inactive, which would be pretty cool and actually be really useful in a production scenario. But for our use case today, we're going to use that, and we're going to come back over here to our storefront creation, and we're going to refresh it so we pull in that new context, and then we'll scroll down over here. And the next thing we'll do is do a create records. and we're creating a record inside of this platform event. So it's not a typical create records that you're used to, but we're going to create the user platform event record. And we'll do this right here, and we'll do, okay, then we'll do permission set, and you can see that the permission set one we just created is permission set __ e, which is an event. So we want to definitely create this one and not this one. But it'll become very clear because really the only two values are our user ID and our permission set name. So we'll pass in our user ID, and that's going to come from the user ID from the user create records action here. So we'll pass that in, and then secondarily we will pass in the permission set name. So what we'll need to do is go over to our permission sets, and we'll need to find the permission set we want to pass. I believe this one is just buyer, right? So we want to make sure that the person has a buyer, and we'll put that in as the value here, and then we'll click done, and we will have created kind of the shell of what we need for that platform event. Now that we have kind of the success path fully driven down here, the last thing we'll want to put in here is a screen saying that it was successful. Now what we could do is do another decision split to make sure that we got the ID back from this event and everything was successful. Just for time's sake today, we're just going to do a quick screen action here, and we're just going to basically say that it was successful. But it probably would be a good idea to come back in here and make sure that that permission set was successfully added. Otherwise, we would want to roll everything back. So let's go in and put something like your user was successfully created. All right. All right, that looks good. Then we'll go to our footer and we'll do the same thing, hide. And yeah, we should be good to go. It looks like we got to do one more thing here. So user created. Okay, and let's go done. Okay, one last thing here just for my own sanity, and something you should definitely do if you're doing any of these actions here, is you should come in and always add in a fault path for the create records here so that you have a really good user experience if something does break. Let's make sure we have all of those crates successfully thrown over here. And you kind of have a couple different options with these. Is you can either put individual screen flows in here to say something broke basically, but for simplicity we're basically going to go and connect this to this path right here. So now it's going to the failed user creation, and we'll do the same thing with this, connect it. Don't you love when it does that? We'll put it right here, and so now we have a couple of faults, so that'll actually go over into the right screen. Last thing we'll do here is we will throw in one more item, and we actually don't need that. We need this right here, and we want to do a rollback records, and we'll say rollback. All right, so this is just in case it fails low in the record creations down here. That'll actually roll back all that information, and we can make sure it does not break. But we actually want to throw that threw that in the wrong spot, so we're going to cut this and we're going to paste it right here. Okay, so now that we've done that, I think we're far enough along where we actually can activate this, and we're going to go back over here to our objects. We'll go to contact. Okay, we're going to come over to buttons, links, and actions, and then we're going to click new action, and we're going to change this to flow, and it will be our storefront user creation. We're going to give it a label called create storefront user, and we're going to click save. Okay, last thing we need to do before we can actually fully test this is we need to create that second flow that we will actually be handling the permission sets. So we'll come over here and click new flow again, and this is going to be based off of platform event triggered flow. And we're going to come and choose our platform event, which should be the permission set one. Yep, here we go. And from here, we are going to throw in a create records, and this is going to be the create permission set for our user. And pretty straightforward, should just be, let's select the separate resources, and we're going to do permission set assignment. And this is where we'll actually come in and throw in our assignee ID, which will be, let's go back up to our records here, will be the user ID right here. Okay, last thing we need to do, actually, we're going to save this, and right before this, we need to go do a get to get the actual permission set ID. So let's do get permission set, and we'll do permission set, and we're going to get it based on the name that we're going to be passed in, and this will be down to our records here, the permission set custom field name right here. We'll get one, yep, and then we're actually going to use this information to specify which permission set. Yep, it'll be the get right here and the ID of that. All right, so now let's just make sure we don't need any of the other fields. Nope, we don't need the expire zone, we don't need the group. All right, so we just need the assignee and we need the permission set ID, and click done here. Same thing as we probably should throw a fault here and have kind of that experience, but for time's sake, again, we're just going to leave it as is. And we're going to call this the permission set creation flow. And we will activate that as well. All right, so now going back up to our Lucid chart here, we now have all three things stitched in place here. We have the get contact, get user, the screens to do this, updating the contact, creating the platform event, and creating the actual permission set through this new flow. So now we're going to go back over, and we should be able to go back into Salesforce and to our contact here, and what we'll do is go to edit page, and we're going to go up to our top section here, and we are going to upgrade to dynamic actions. You're going to have to do this manually the first time, but if you've used it in the past, it'll be here and it'll look something like this. I know I just skimmed over that, but that is not the point of this video, so we can definitely do another one in the future if you're interested. But we'll come in here and we'll throw in the Storefront actions, and this is the important part right here, this visibility here. So I want to use that new field that I created called Storefront user, and when it equals true, this should be visible. That's going to be the key here, and it looks like it's not going to let me. Okay, sometimes the screen is a little bit wonky here. Maybe I just, zoom it out one. Here we go. Is true. Okay, so once this is true, or when this is true, we will show the button. And actually, I think we want this reversed. Yeah, we do want this reversed. So we actually want this to be false, so that when it's true, which is what we set in the flow, it will not show. So that, this is exactly what we want here. So you can see that's visibility criteria on here as well. And we're going to bring this up a bit because that is really low down in the list here. Let's bring it up a little bit higher here, and we'll just throw it to the top, right next to the edit here. So it'll be the first one down. Okay, so we'll click save. And now everything should be in place for us to actually use this. So you can see it's a little bit involved to get this all set up, but once you do it, it provides a really scalable solution for both this and potentially other user and permission set use cases. Okay, so now let's give it a whirl for the first time and see if everything is working correctly. So let's actually create a new contact, and we're going to go over and we're going to do a new contact here, and we'll do this as test Shane, and let's fill in my email address, so test@shane.com, and that should be enough for now. And now that we have this new contact created, we can go and click create Storefront user. It should pop up a modal. Yep, looks like it pulled over everything for us. And then in the nickname field, we can say, we want this to be Shane 1. And we'll click next here and we'll see what happens. Okay, and you can see that it said we are successful. I actually did just get a flow error here, so I wanted to mention it on the video here so you guys can catch that issue as well. But it basically said that it created the user, and so if we go over to the user, we can see that it did create the test Shane, and it did populate all the information for us, and it did assign it to the right profile for us, but the permission set was not assigned. That is because permission set assignments are super confusing, and so our permission sets, I went in here, and originally this was name, and it basically was not pulling back any information because the name was not there. So you actually gotta use the label here in order to find the right permission set, and once you do that, then it will be successful in actually creating the permission set. But I'll activate this, and then you guys can test it out and everything, but then that will go through the full user and then permission set creation for you as well. So hopefully that was helpful for everyone. I feel like this is a really good use case for a storefront creation because this is something that every single storefront needs to have. But feel free to put comments in, give us a like if this was interesting for you, and keep giving us content ideas, and looking forward to talking with you guys next time.